Taylor. Thanks, Kate. I'm with the California Coalition for Rural Housing, and I'm one of the presenters for the TCC, Equitable Housing Strategy. So I just want to thank the other TA providers in the room as well as SGC. And if you all have questions throughout, we are monitoring the chat, and we also have time at the end for that. So thank you all for being here. Hope we can share some knowledge and start some of these great projects going. Next slide, please, Kate. And just some general housekeeping things. I mean, I know we're 3 years into Zoom meetings, but please, when you're not talking, please try to keep yourself on mute. Again, if you have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat. And yeah, looking forward to knowing you all. So the agenda today, we're going to go over welcome and introductions. We're doing that now. Good job, y'all. Then we'll get into the TCC Equitable Housing Strategy, what it is, what are some of the things you need to know, thresholds, all the really nitty gritty fun stuff. Then we'll move into some Q&A and then move into next steps if you are considering going forward with a TCC application. So TCC is a program that provides TA along with the rest of the services. So we are part of a much larger TA team. However, for the housing specific portions, we have the California Coalition for Rural Housing, which is the organization I represent. And we are a statewide advocacy organization specializing in rural farm worker and tribal communities throughout the state. And our other partner is Enterprise Community Partners, a nationwide nonprofit focusing on supporting affordable housing as a tool for households to access opportunities. And I know both of us could go on about our organizations, but that's not why we're here today. So thank you all for the housing TA providers as well as all the TA providers here on the call. So what is the learning objective? Why are we here? You know, I know we might all be a little groggy from lunch, but we're here today to learn to train prospective TCC applicants on the major housing threshold requirements within the whole Transformative Climate Communities program. The goal is to help prepare applicants interested in including a housing component within TCC. All right, so TCC, we have modeled this with the base knowledge of TCC. So TCC focuses on the implementation grant strategies. And the one we have bolded and highlighted and up at the top is that equitable housing and neighborhood development. Now with TCC, this housing project would be a part of a multitude of different grant strategies, at least 3. And this includes land acquisition for affordable housing, and then some of the other components that make a more holistic community-based projects, such as health and well-being, brownfield redevelopment, and water efficiency and resiliency, just to name a few. There's 11 strategies on here, so plenty of different things to help benefit your local community. Next slide, please, Kate. So, implementation grant funding. We know building affordable housing in this state currently costs a lot of money. So how much money is available for this round? So this round, we have $88.5 million available for round 5 implementation. And as it stands now, SGC is planning on awarding 3 of these implementation grants worth $29.5 million each. So just start thinking about that in terms of not only the housing component of your TCC application, but also with those other strategies. All right, so next slide. And then I'm going to pass it on to my colleague, Kate Roos.
Thank you, Clancy. Appreciate it. So let's get into the details of how AHSC is integrated into TCC for the next round, which is round 5. First of all, for the equitable housing and neighborhood development strategy that Clancy showed you on a previous slide, TCC relies on the AHSC guidelines. In other words, the AHSC guidelines are incorporated into the TCC program for that specific strategy. So when you apply to TCC, if you want to include a housing development, you will have to select the equitable housing and neighborhood development strategy in the TCC application. And then you'll be required to fulfill the AHSC requirements from the current round of AHSC, which is round 7. We'll go over those requirements next. And I'll just note that thankfully there's a lot of shared goals between AHSC and TCC, so the 2 programs are a great match. So next I'll go into the details of what AHSC and then by extension TCC can fund. So because the AHSC guidelines are, again, incorporated into TCC, you'll essentially have to do an AHSC application if you want to fund housing development with TCC. In order to see if your housing development is eligible for TCC funding, this slide shows the types of eligible housing projects that you can apply to in TCC. The most common type of eligible housing developments we see in AHSC are rental developments, which can include multifamily developments as well as senior projects. Some, but not all projects include mixed use. This slide shows a completed AHSC funded project in Los Angeles. Note that you must use AHSC or TCC funding to help fund the new housing development. Okay, so other but less common housing developments that we see in AHSC are home ownership, substantial rehabilitation, and conversion developments. Here's an example on the slide of an awarded home ownership project from AHSC round 6. And the point that we're making is that there are various housing development options that are eligible to fund through AHSC and through TCC. So next we'll go into the details of the AHSC housing requirements that are incorporated into TCC to see if you have an eligible project. So there are developer and site control requirements, which I'll cover on the next slide. You must also have land use approvals and environmental clearances in place by time of application. You're required to do all electric construction. You must not have begun construction yet at time of application, and construction must be completed within 5 years of the award. You must also be within a jurisdiction with a compliant housing element. And there's quite a few other threshold requirements too, but these are the ones that we felt were most pertinent to share. So you can see from the list on this slide that there are a variety of organizations that can participate as applicants. A key takeaway that we want you to know is that an affordable housing developer needs to be the primary applicant on every application. And that's because there's an experience requirement around housing development. The developer needs to have at least 2 projects completed within the past 10 years that are similar in both size and scope to the proposed housing project. So if you're interested in including a housing component in your TCC application, but you are not an affordable housing developer, please reach out to a technical assistance provider and we can help get you connected to groups who may be able to have that experience and may be interested to partner with you on this housing project. And then finally, it's worth noting that special purpose entities, so for example, if you're setting up an LP or something similar to be the ultimate borrower on behalf of the project, those special purpose entities are not eligible applicants. If you apply as a special purpose entity, even if you as the developer have the requisite experience, you'll be deemed ineligible during threshold review. So don't apply as a special purpose entity. And here we just want to highlight another key threshold item. This tends to impact our more rural and suburban projects, but it's applicable to all applicants with an AHSC component. And it's the requirement that all sites be classified as infill. And the first test of this, so to speak, is to ensure that you're meeting this requirement using a tool called the Farmland Mapping and Monitoring tool to ensure that you're not proposing to build on a site that's currently designated as farmland. And here we have a kind of screenshot of that tool and a call out of the map legend. So you can see that there's multiple different designations of farmland. If for some reason you do find that the site that you're trying to apply for is flagged as farmland, there is a possible exemption that the program allows. If you can demonstrate that either 75% or 3 sides of your site perimeter is surrounded by developed uses, and there's a list of what qualifies as development that you can talk to your TA provider about. And you're in either an incorporated city or a designated urban service area, you're in the clear. And just a note here that tribal applicants may apply for an exemption to the requirement to be located within an urbanized area or urban cluster. I think we can put a link in the chat if we haven't already of the farmland mapping tool just for you to double check your project site with. And next, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Christine to talk about the fun part, money.
Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Hi, everyone. Yes, that link is in the chat a couple times now, so definitely check your site. My name is Christine Williams. I'm also a TA provider with Enterprise Community Partners, so nice to be in the Zoom room with all of you. So this slide sort of talks you through how to think about your funding request as it relates to your housing site. You'll recall, it's been mentioned a couple times, AHSC is a component, a single component within your overall TCC application. So it is not going to be the only capital project you'll be asking for funding for. And therefore, you need to think about your funding request for that housing project as being below that $29.5 million award limit, because that will be intended to fund more than just the housing site. And so you'll be working across the overall TCC project team within your community to determine how your housing request fits into the overall budget. If you're familiar with AHSC, you'll note that this 29.5 million limit is less than a typical AHSC application, but can be an important source of gap financing for your housing project. Also, unlike AHSC, you're not constrained to any type of funding minimum. And so you can size your housing ask in a way that hopefully complements the overall TCC submittal package. Next slide, please. Again, it's been mentioned that TCC requires that your housing project meet AHSC minimum programmatic thresholds. And so what does that mean in terms of developing your application scope? When you're thinking of including a housing project, the bare minimum you'll need to have is one, a funding request tied to the capital costs of your housing development, and then at least one other scoping component that reduces greenhouse gas emissions, and it does that through reducing vehicle miles traveled. So here on the screen is language lifted out of the final TCC Round 5 guidelines as potential eligible partner scope that you could include within your overall AHSC ask under the TCC umbrella. And you can see that things like expanded transit service, transit capital projects, bike and pedestrian infrastructure, car share, and other type of programming is all eligible. And again, you'll want to work with your technical assistance provider to ensure that you're packaging project scope that meets these minimum eligibility requirements. Again, if there are any questions as we're going through here, feel free to drop them in the chat. I'm going to bump over to my colleague Alejandro now to go into more details on the housing specific requirements.
Thanks, Christine. This is Alejandro Huerta with Enterprise, Senior Program Director. I wanted to just pipe in here a little bit. If you have any questions that come up during our presentation, please feel free to put them into the chat. We can kind of answer them as they come or save them to the end. So don't be shy. Feel free to put in questions into the chat. So, okay, I'll go into the next steps for you if you're thinking about adding an AHSC TCC housing component. So once you've determined if you have one of the eligible housing developments Kate mentioned in the earlier slides, you next have to meet these two requirements. The first one is to make sure that transit is available near your site, and I'll explain that in more detail in a bit, and that your housing development needs to meet a minimum density. So it's important to remember that you must fulfill all these requirements if you wish to use TCC funding to help fund a new housing development. These two factors on this slide determine your affordable housing project area type, which is defined by the AHSC guidelines. Let me go into the details next. So the first requirement for transit availability is that it has to be within a half-mile walkable distance to your housing site. And I want to emphasize the walkable route. This is very important because if you do not have a transit stop that's along a walkable route, then you cannot apply to TCC. But there are some exceptions, which I'll go into later. The first thing though to figure out is if there is a transit stop or station within that half-mile walkable distance to your housing site. So I'll give you an example. This is a completed ASIC project from a couple of rounds ago. So here you can see the housing site is in the middle, and then the blue transit station is within a half-mile walking distance. So you have to first identify that. Secondly, you must also make sure that the transit at that stop or station passes at least once or twice during the peak periods in the morning and afternoon. So in other words, it's a two-part test. First, there has to be transit, and then it has to pass at that frequency at least. Next, I'll go into the specific types of transit availability and how they determine your project area type. So the type of transit serving your housing site determines the project area type listed here that your project falls under. But there is one exception, as I said earlier, to the rule that your project must be served by qualifying transit by the time of application. And that exception is that for rural or RIP-up projects, you're allowed to get that qualifying transit service in place by the time you actually get your certificate of occupancy for your building. So in other words, this gives a little bit more leeway and time for rural areas to be able to partner with public partners and transit agencies to identify that transit stop and to have it in place in service by the time of the certificate of occupancy. So with that, I'm going to hand it back to Christine to explain more about what the different types of transit are and additional requirements for the project area types.
Thanks, Alejandro. A couple questions coming in sort of related to scoring. So I do want to note we are going to cover that. But as mentioned, again, you do have to meet ASIC's minimum program threshold requirements. And part of that is ensuring that your housing project qualifies as one of the 3 project area types listed on this slide. Project area types are determined by the type of transit that is within a half-mile of your proposed housing site. And as you can see, there are 3 categories. If your site is served by what is referred to as high quality transit, that means that within a half-mile, you have some type of transit that comes at least 15 minutes or less, what we call its peak period service frequency, every 15 minutes or less, and it has permanent infrastructure. So that means it's running on some sort of rail system, tracks, or has a dedicated bus rapid transit lane available. Then your project will fall under the TOD, transit-oriented development category. If your site does not have transit that meets those high quality transit requirements, and you're also not located in a designated rural area, then you fall into what we call the ICP category, or you're an integrated connectivity project. And then if your site qualifies as rural, and again, isn't proximate to that high quality transit, you are designated what we call a RIPA, or a rural innovation project area type. And knowing which project area type you qualify as is important because they each have their own minimum density threshold, which is listed here on the screen. If you are a TOD project, your housing site must have a minimum of 30 dwelling units per acre. If you're an ICP, that drops down to 20 units per acre. And for rural projects, they must have 15 units to the acre in terms of density. And I'm going to bump it back over to Kate to continue talking about some of TCC scoring requirements.
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, hopefully these next couple of slides will answer some of the questions that are coming through on the chat with regard to scoring. So we heard about ASIC's key requirements and the project area types from Christine. Another takeaway here is that because you are required to only meet minimum threshold requirements as it pertains to ASIC, you do not need to be concerned about maximizing your scoring under the ASIC rubric. So unlike ASIC, where you have a minimum amount of, where you have to score a minimum amount of points, there is no minimum TCC score. And this is also the case for the GHG score. Next, I'll go into some other key differences between ASIC and TCC. So those of you familiar with ASIC know that there are a lot of elements required as a part of a successful application, but do you need all of these elements for your TCC application? Fortunately, the answer is no. There is some streamlining of the two programs here. So for example, you don't need to do the quantitative policy scoring pieces from ASIC. These are things like extra points for green building certification, extra points for housing and transportation collaboration and location efficiency. Similarly, you don't need to complete the ASIC narrative. You will instead need to complete a TCC narrative. And just to note here, you do also need to complete the community engagement tracker, the community needs letter of support. And a note here, if you're planning future community engagement, you have the option to include that within the letter of support too. You do need to do the climate matrix and the ASIC application workbook. Ask your TA provider for guidance on what components of the ASIC workbook you'll need to complete as it pertains to TCC. Next, I'll go ahead and pass it over to Clancy to kick off our Q&A.
Yeah, so now we hand the mic back over to you all, as so to speak. So this is your time to ask questions and all of that. So please pop them in the chat or simply use the raise your hand function and we'll try to get some questions answered. Selena, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Hey everyone, this is Selena Jimenez, Director of Economic Development for the City of Coachella. And I just wanted to ask, so how many housing projects has TCC funded since inception? Because the City of Coachella did, we were the only applicant that proposed affordable housing under TCC through AHSC, and we were not successful in round 3. And so it left me feeling like, okay, so what, I mean, it felt like is TCC really the vehicle to fund ASIC, projects? And so I just wanted to ask that question so that we know how many affordable or how many housing projects have been funded through TCC that through AHSC.
Yeah, I might see if Jennifer, not to put you on the spot at SGC, but if you know the answer to that. I know in early rounds of the program, most, if not every project included some type of ASIC component.
Yeah, I could answer that really quick. So we've had a total of 5 housing projects across 3 of rounds 1 through 3 of TCC. I believe all 3 of the first rounds projects all had a housing component, and then there was 1 in round 2 and 1 in round 3, but so the most recent ones in round 2 and 3 were Sacramento and Oakland, and so
and they were funded.
What was that?
Yeah, they were funded.
Yes, they were funded. So these are existing awarded grantees. If you'd like to take a look at.
Oh, thank you. Yes, I'll take a look. Thank you for that.
And Selena, do you have another question?
No, I'm sorry, I do not. Thank you. Not this time.
No worries. Thank you. Domingo.
So the city of Barstow applied to an AHSC and we were not competitive because of the GHGs. Would this be an option that we can submit that same project and not be affected by the GHGs?
So potentially, Domingo, you would still need to include at least 2 other, Clancy mentioned at the top, strategies. So you couldn't just resubmit only the ASIC component under the TCC program. TCC is meant to sort of integrate across, as on the, Clancy brought it up on the, or maybe Kate brought it up on the screen here. You need at least 3 what are called strategies included in a TCC application, and your ASIC component would meet only 1 of them. So if you did have 2 other project types or strategies that would benefit Barstow, then it could be a way to get that housing component funded without having to, compete in the way ASIC has applicants do as it relates to the GHG scoring.
Thank you very much. That gives us hope. Thank you.
Great.
And I can add a little bit more to that too, because and Domingo, as you know, the GHGs for ASIC prioritize transit a lot. With 20 out of the 30 points basically coming from transit. So this TCC is different. It doesn't have that much of an emphasis on the transit GHG. So I think that's what differentiates TCC, among other things, from ASIC.
Thank you, Alejandro. I know you're familiar with the project. I just don't want to waste anybody's time. If you guys were a lot of help with us, and we did a lot of work, and the developer did a lot of work. So I'm just trying to make sure that if I need to start that communication again with that developer, based on this criteria.
Sure. And I just want to add one last thing, as Christine said, really the difference is that this is a larger holistic scope than ASIC. So I think the real key to ask yourselves is, are you positioning yourselves to really have a large holistic project that goes beyond just the housing? I'll pass it back to you, Clancy.
Thank you. And I know we had a question in the chat about GHG quantification support. Christine did say yes, the TA does provide that technical support. And Selena, do you have another question?
Yes, I just wanted to build on that question about the GHG quantification support. I just wanted to convey to SGC and just everyone involved, if there's any way to really amp up that support, because we were fortunate to have been working with a developer that was able to commission the support of a company that conducted the GHG quantifications for the affordable housing project that we had proposed. And so we had that information, but then we didn't have all of the information for the rest of our strategies. And we actually had a really very robust strategy that merited more GHG points in the application. And we ended up being scored due to that lack of the GHG emissions quantifications calculations. Our score was equal to another competitors, right? And we knew that there was no way that our score could be like anywhere close to theirs, because we had a lot of strategies that were going to yield a whole lot of benefits. And so I was just hoping that SGC looks at that closely to ensure that people do have that adequate support, because actually it is not that easy to quantify your GHGs. It is not. It is if you're doing urban greening. There's a tool online and it makes it super easy to compute. But if you're computing like all the appliances inside the multifamily housing development or just other GHGs that you can throw in, it actually is not that easy. So I just wanted to really make that clear so that there's robust support for that. Or if there's an online tool that I don't know about, if someone could point me to it, that'd be great. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Selena. There are a couple questions dropping into the chat, and I wonder if, well, I will note for, let's see, there was a question about kind of scoping a competitive TCC application generally. So this workshop is very specific to just the housing component. I think there have been other virtual workshops that have kind of more broadly looked at the TCC process as a whole. And I don't know, Clancy, if those are up, and we can drop links to those videos if you're curious about learning about the program more broadly. And then I'm wondering if someone from SGC or even Riley, there's a question about structuring kind of the different applicants, and TCC again treats this differently than the ASIC program. So scrolling up to find that. The question is around if a city is interested in submitting a TCC grant, for a variety of different projects and then decides to include an ASIC component, would the city be a co-lead applicant with the housing developer, or would the city be the lead and the housing developer is a co-applicant? So maybe just some general info on kind of how TCC structures its applicants across all of the projects could be helpful here.
I can chime in with just like what we've seen in the past. It really kind of is a question of like who the lead grantee is better fit to be. Like if it's the city, that should be kind of helping coordinate all of the other grantees within the application and the project, and kind of playing more of like an administering like middle role. And typically that's been the case. We haven't seen like a housing developer be the lead applicant necessarily, and more typically they are the co-applicant. But you know, every situation is different, and if so that is a little more likely situation. But if your situation is unique, I'm sure we could all discuss and provide support.
Thanks, Jennifer. And then really quickly, I'm just going to get to Jason's question in the chat. So Jason, your project area type is determined by the type of transit that is in place at the time of application submittal. So if you'd had and Alejandro and Kate, feel free to chime in here. If you weren't currently operating that transit at that 15-minute peak headway by the actual date of submission, then I don't think you would fall into that TOD category.
Right. And then don't forget, if you're thinking about TOD, you have to have the permanent infrastructure as well.
Right. So even if you had 15-minute headways, Jason, if you weren't operating that route on some type of permanent fixed infrastructure, it still would not be a TOD. It would bump into that ICP category. Great. I know we have a couple hands back up. Clancy, I don't know if you're. Ooh,
yeah, we'll get, in terms of HCD and housing elements, yes, for the TCC application by the time of award. So that will be December. We'll get into the dates and what the next steps are. So by the time of award, you will need to have an in compliance housing element according to HCD. And then Haley, we'll go ahead. Do you have a question you'd like to ask?
Yes. Sorry, I'm like brand new to this. So let me know if I'm understanding this correctly. So ASIC has a separate application process and separate scoring and evaluation process. However, TCC now contains a component for housing that complements the ASIC guidelines. Is that correct? So, and the goal is to serve as gap funding on top of ASIC. So do we have to apply for ASIC and TCC at the same time? Or is it possible to secure ASIC funding in 1 year and TCC another?
So would you be talking about that for the same housing project?
Correct.
So if you still had a gap following an ASIC award and you were still going to meet, because ASIC does have requirements around when you're starting construction and things like that. If you were still meeting those thresholds and you still had a gap that could be filled by TCC, I don't see why you couldn't include the same project in a TCC application. I don't think we've ever seen anyone do that. Typically, after they secure an ASIC award, they move on to the next step, which is to secure their credits or bonds. But I don't know if any of my colleagues or anyone on SGC side has anything to add there.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify, Haley, I'm not sure I fully understand your question, but I think there's some confusion perhaps. One is in previous rounds, the ASIC round and the TCC round were simultaneous with one another. So in some couple of rounds ago, for example, people applied to both AHSC and TCC at the same time. And if they were awarded, they had to figure out like which award they would receive or some combination thereof. And then I think maybe more pragmatically, your question might be is in terms of the actual application process. So if you are interested in applying for a housing development in TCC, I think maybe the confusion is that you would apply to TCC, but the AHSC workbook is part of that overall TCC application. So maybe there's some confusion there. So in other words, if you're applying for the housing development funding under TCC, you will be required to fill out the AHSC workbook.
Got it. Sorry, like I said, I'm brand new into this space, so apologies.
It's confusing, and that's why we're here to clarify.
I'm also wondering if you could go back to the slide with the minimum TCC requirements. I remember it was required to have affordable housing and then the list, yes. Sorry, I just wanted to catch up on this, maybe take a screenshot. Thank you.
Yeah, and you'll note, Haley, that it is just at least one of the following here. So there is a menu of options there. So.
And just to note that you don't have to try to take too many screenshots either. We will follow up with folks who have registered for this event with the PowerPoint and link to the recording.
Thank you.
I do want to note there's a question in the chat around leveraging as it applies to your broader TCC application. So the question is, can you include previously awarded state-funded projects as leveraged project funds in a current TCC application? I'm going to bump it either to Riley or Jennifer to comment on that leveraged question.
I'm so sorry. Could we repeat the question, or is it in
Yes, it is in the chat. Let me find it here. It's whether you can include previously awarded state-funded projects as leveraged project funds in the current TCC application.
I believe so, but let me check the guidelines right now because I know that we made a recent change, because in the past we weren't able to count funds that were awarded before, but like made a kind of incorporated some flexibility for this round. I just have to get the fine print. Let me get that maybe as we're answering a different question.
Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks to Riley for dropping some links in the chat as well.
Yeah, Selena, do you have another question?
No, I just wanted to, the only thing I wanted to obtain further clarification on, and I think Alejandro summed it up, is the proximity to transit, to transit stop, right? So if you're proposing housing, it must be within a half-mile radius and already be in place by the time of application submission, correct?
That's correct. There is an exemption for projects that classify as rural, where if the transit is not in place by the time of application, it needs to be in place by the time basically your certificates of occupancy are issued for the housing site.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, okay. Yeah, because what I was going to say to that is that we are just on the cusp of being rural, but because our census count came in at like 41,000, we're just a hair away from being rural. So the most ideal situation would have been at certificate of occupancy versus at the time of application.
Yeah, I hear that. That was a change made to the round 7 guidelines that disallowed that carve out except for rural applications.
Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I see a question from Sheila in the chat about guidelines for community involvement, and I can maybe take a stab at it, and my peers can chime in if I've left anything out. But community engagement in AHSC world is typically scored through the narrative. So this time, because you'll be using the TCC narrative, you'll be answering questions related to what you did for community engagement in TCC's narrative. But you'll also be required, and let me see if I can pull up the slide. You'll also be required to include these things here, the community engagement tracker, as backup to that narrative. And this tracker is just a spreadsheet where you can list all of the community engagement that you've done for the particular project that you're requesting funding for, whether it was, general plan updates or, process to go through your entitlements, the community engagement you did for that. And then also the community needs support letter. And then new, I believe this round is if you are planning to do future community engagement after you prepare your application, you can also wrap that into your community needs support letter. So I'll pause there and see if Christine and Alejandro may want to add anything. Nope. Okay, great.
No, just to add, the community engagement is really supposed to be meaningful and thoughtful, and the emphasis really is on making sure that it's accessible as well. So, whether that's language, culturally appropriate, outreach, etc. So just want to emphasize that. Great.
We have another question in the chat from Gilbert. I think it's asking how AHSC defines qualifying transit. So I was trying to paste it in, but it wasn't formatting very well. Essentially, Gilbert, qualifying transit needs to be on a fixed route, so like a typical local bus service, and it needs to depart at least 2 times on the same route during peak hours as defined by the transit operator. So it's actually pretty flexible. So you could have a transit operator define peak hours as 6 to 9 a.m. in the mornings. And as long as you had service from a single route departing from one stop at least twice during that time frame, that would qualify. I've seen some latitude in how peak hours are defined to sort of be very broad, but really just a service line that is running at least twice servicing a stop with the same route within a peak hour period. And I'm just reading some of these. Yes, Kayla is adding some additional context in the chat. Thank you. Thank you, Clancy. Okay. Yes, there's a question about how the draft guidelines had a 90% enforceable funding commitment required. Yes, so this has changed from AHSC used to require that your housing project had 90% of its financing committed. That was inclusive of your AHSC request. They have now changed that. So they no longer require this hard 90% enforceable funding commitment. And so, I mean, as I understand it, that means projects do not need to have that level of funding committed to include an AHSC project within their TCC application. There is not a level of funding required that is specified within the AHSC guidelines. Our understanding is that HCD will conduct its own financial feasibility analysis of your project after submittal. And I don't have a lot of details as to what that includes specifically. Okay, continuing to scroll. Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm like, I think we're caught up on questions in the chat.
I think so, yeah. This has been good.
Yeah, still welcoming any questions. We have about 10 minutes left here, so, and then, yeah, Riley, Jennifer, anything else you all want to add while we have this space?
I can add really quickly. Since we got a few questions that were about the TCC program overall, I encourage you all to review and to go to the TCC website, and there are resources, including links to technical assistance resources that where you can learn more about the TCC implementation grant at a big picture level. The technical assistance process is also about to officially launch with a application initiation form. So that will be your first step toward accessing technical assistance to meet with one of us directly or several of us directly in the next couple of weeks. Our teams have also developed a resource guide, which is sort of a worksheet or workbook that you can use to start on your application. And it does look big picture at some of those questions and priorities, such as community engagement and leverage funding. So that will be sent out to you all in I believe in the next week or two. That will be available on the TCC website as well.
Thanks, Riley, and thanks really to the whole TA team. I just wanted to also let everyone know that the notice of funding availability will be released with the application materials will be released March 8th, so about a week from now. If you go to the TCC page, it should have kind of the whole timeline to like when, yes, I'm listening now. But there will also be application workshops. I think they may already be scheduled and publicized, but that'll be the place to really kind of hear about the whole program as a whole and the whole application. And so please be tuned in for that if you're interested. And want to make a really quick plug also to folks in the room might want to take a look at the TCC guidelines strategy 2 as well, because we recently in this round kind of expanded the allowable costs in there. And so it covers some land acquisition costs and like construction and property costs for other potentially other housing types. Thank you all.
Thank you, Jennifer and Riley. So yeah, we'll just take the next few minutes and walk through next steps and some timeline stuff. To answer your question, yes, William, they are still doing planning grants this round. There's $900,000 allocated to that. There's also a new grant type called project implementation. And again, more information in the guidelines about that. So what are we looking at timelines? A week from now is the NOFO release, so keep your eyes peeled. On March 22nd and 23rd, we'll be holding application workshops, a real, time for you to ask questions, time, TA providers are walking through the steps. So there's one on the 22nd for general audiences, and then the ones on the 23rd are one's geared towards tribal audiences and one's geared towards rural and unincorporated disadvantaged communities. So please go and attend the one that makes most sense for your community. So some dates you're gonna need to know if you're interested in applying. March 31st, the request for application technical assistance is due. Application technical assistance is required for implementation grants. So if you're thinking about it, that should be released on the website in the next few weeks, and you'll need to submit that simple form by the 31st. On May 1st, there will be an application pre-proposal due, again, only for the implementation grants. That is May 1st of this year. And then we're looking at for all grant types, all three, final applications are due August 1 this year. Got pushed back a little bit further, give folks a little bit more time during the busy summer. And then this means awards got pushed back a month as well. December 14th, council will be approving the TCC awards. So that gives you a bit of a timeline of what we're all working with here. Next slide, please, Kate. So these application workshops we've been talking about, here's some more specific info. Like Kate said, we'll be sending out this PowerPoint. So those links work. Click on the link, register for what makes sense for your community at this time. Next slide, please, Kate. So next steps. What we recommend here, go ahead and do a little bit more reviewing of those AHSC and the TCC round 5 guidelines. There's the link to the TCC resources page where you can get connected to that TA, where you can get connected to, I heard there was housing in these previous rounds 1, 2, and 3. All of those projects are available on TCC's website, hosted by SGC. So if you are curious about what's been done before, take some inspiration and go off and do great things in your community. You can always email TA providers. Our emails are down there. We'll be happy to hear from you. Or you can, next slide, please, Kate. Or you can contact TCC at SGC if it is not a question that the TA providers can help you with. So I just want to thank you all again for your time and your interest. And, you know, we are here, here to help, here to support, and good luck going forward. And thanks for your dedication to your community. So that's all we got for today. And so I think the TA providers will stay on until 2, just the last few minutes if folks have a question, but otherwise you are welcome to go forth on your Wednesday and have a great week.